Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs will come to order. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by welcoming our distinguished guest for her first time before this subcommittee in her new role, U.S. Aid almost Ambassador Administrator, Samantha Power. Now, as this hearing is virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters first. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. Let me remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies during the question and answer period. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I may gently tap the gavel or raise my hand to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. After the panel presents their testimony, we will follow the order of recognition set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markup. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. So now I will proceed to welcome Administrator Samantha Power back to the Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs. You're certainly no stranger to members of our subcommittee from your years serving as United Nations Ambassador to your various other roles, champion human rights, atrocity prevention, democracy promotion, and multilateralism. It's really wonderful to have you with us today, Administrator Powell. This is, of course, our first opportunity to welcome you as Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, a role to which you bring a depth of knowledge and exceptional qualifications. We are grateful to have you at the helm of America's foremost international development agency and for being with us today. Tomorrow, the administration will release the detailed fiscal year 2022 budget request for programs and activities under the jurisdiction of the subcommittee. USAID's portion of the request is expected to increase at least, mind you, just at least 10% above the current level. I want to start with this fundamental question. Will the administration's budget request place development on an equal footing with diplomacy and defense? One of the many painful lessons of COVID-19 is that we can no longer afford to under-prioritize USAID's mission of saving lives, reducing poverty, strengthening democratic governance, and helping people emerge from humanitarian crises. These objectives are just as important to our security as our alliances around the world and our military operations. Of course, poverty and poor governance are not problems the United States can fix with a magic wand. USAID does its best work when we work alongside local people and communities to help them develop themselves, their countries, and their own communities. To be enduring our development efforts, we must support these local actors and make sure their priorities are reflected in our programs. Your predecessors, such as Raj Shah, Gail Smith, and Mark Green, prioritize this. And I am interested to hear your plans to work directly with more local partners, as well as how our appropriations legislation can help these efforts. The core strength of USAID is and always has been its devoted and passionate public servants from the top down. Yet I remain very concerned about longstanding institutional barriers to diversity that exist in many of our foreign policy agencies. Administrator Power, I know you are working on diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies for USAID. So I'd like to know how we can partner with you in ensuring that the agency draws strength from the diversity of America. The administration's request is expected to propose necessary investments to respond to and recover from the coronavirus pandemic, as well as ensure that we are much better prepared for future global health threats. For both moral and scientific reasons, America must act with great urgency to help other countries contain the virus. The scope of the problem, as you know, is enormous. COVID threatens to erase decades of anti-poverty gains. This means we must make investments at the scale of the challenges in front of us. But beyond recovery, we need to catch up to ensure that we are able to help our partners achieve the Sustainable Development Goals on schedule by 2030. And so I look forward to hearing your detailed strategy for achieving the SDGs. Democracy's backsliding, that's a real challenge. Even before the pandemic, there was enormous concern, and yet we've seen authoritarian tendencies grow even stronger over the last year. Freedom House reports that nearly 75% of the world's population lives in a country that faced deterioration last year in democratic freedoms. And so I'd appreciate hearing your views how the United States can advance democracy abroad, even as we acknowledge and commit to fixing our democratic weaknesses at home. Does USAID have the resources it needs to work in new and creative arenas, not just on political parties and elections, but on also cultural norms and institutional changes needed to truly advance democratic values? Lastly, I'm hopeful that your leadership will bring a renewed commitment to prioritizing women at the center of development. This should include making up for lost time in the area of family planning, which has not received an increase in funding in over a decade. We can't make long-term gains toward any of our development goals while leaving out the reproductive health care needs of women, especially after a global pandemic, which we know disproportionately affected them. When women, especially those living in underserved remote areas, have access to family planning information, contraceptives, and services, they have healthier pregnancies and babies. They contribute productively to their families and communities, and their children are much more likely to go to school. Women and their health should be integrated into all of our developmental efforts and be central to all of our other goals. So, Administrator Powell, I wanted to thank you once again for being here today and for your tireless work to promote human rights and dignity around the world. I look forward to your testimony, but let me first turn to my colleague, our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for his opening statement. Can you unmute, Mr. Rogers?
How's that?
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to our ambassador to USAID. Ambassador, you've taken up your position in very turbulent times. I don't need to remind you. When global humanitarian, health, and development needs are great. I'm pleased we have someone at the helm with your level of commitment to these issues and experience in world affairs. I look forward to working with you in the months ahead. Turning to the President's budget request for fiscal 22, until the full budget request is released tomorrow, we have a limited view of what is being proposed at this point, but I understand it will make history as the biggest request to date for USAID's funding. This will be within the request for a 10% increase over last year's enacted level for both the State Department and USAID. That increase goes up further when you add in the other agencies and related programs funded by this subcommittee. I oppose the draconian cuts proposed by the previous administration for state foreign operations, but I'm also concerned about the magnitude of the increase being proposed in this year's request. Once we have the details, I intend to give it fair consideration, but budgets of this size will be difficult to justify given our country's unprecedented deficits and now its debt. What also should give us pause when considering this request is the significant sums of funding available to USAID that remain unobligated and unexpended. According to the most recent data from the Office of Management and Budget, as of the end of the second quarter of this fiscal year, more than $20 billion remains unobligated from the Development Assistance and Economic Support Fund accounts, and an additional $13.2 billion remains unexpended, and together that's more than $33 billion still sitting on the books, and that is only that's only two accounts. It'll take years to make a dent in those figures. This is not a new phenomenon for USAID, but the size of the problem has grown significantly. This massive pipeline of funding should be carefully considered by this subcommittee and USAID, particularly at a time when there are urgent needs abroad and when fiscal restraint should be taken into consideration. Oversight of funding is another concern that I have, with the administration seeking double-digit increases on top of such significant balances yet unspent. Your agency's ability to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse by having eyes on your programs has been curtailed because of growing insecurity around the world and continued COVID restrictions. It's unclear how either of those constraints will change in the coming year as you are seeking more funds. I hope you will address some of these concerns here today, as well as some of our shared priorities, such as countering Chinese and Russian malign influence and supporting key partners like Colombia. There are more topics that I will address in my questions. So, in closing, I want to acknowledge that these are not easy times to be engaged in international development, to say the least. I salute the dedicated members of USAID's Foreign Service, Civil Service, and Foreign Service nationals for their hard work and commitment to their mission. I thank the chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Now I would like to yield to our full committee Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro, for any comments she may have.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Rogers, for holding this hearing. I too, like you, would like to welcome Ambassador Samantha Power today. Thank her for testifying, and thank her for decades of work supporting our world's most vulnerable people. We are so fortunate to have such an experienced, principled diplomat and leader at the helm of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And this is at a time when American foreign assistance is more important than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored just how imperative it is to care for our neighbors abroad. It has brought into stark relief the principle that one of us suffers, we all suffer. When one of us gets sick, we all get sick. But when development efforts are well funded, the rest of the world is healthier and safer for all of us. As you well know, the world needs strong American leadership, especially through development and humanitarian assistance. And that is why I am glad that President Biden's discretionary request for fiscal year 2022 recommits to those values. To support the global fight against COVID-19, the pandemic, the Biden-Harris administration has requested $10 billion for global health programs and re-engagement with international organizations like the World Health Organization. This includes $1 billion, an $800 million increase from 2021 for global health security. This will not only help our nation and the world recover from this pandemic today, it will also ensure that we are well prepared to tackle any healthcare threats in the future. In addition to the proposals embodied in the discretionary request, I want to thank you, Ambassador and President Biden, for helping deliver COVID-19 vaccines to at-risk populations around the world. It is so good to see that America is taking a rightful role in leading the continuing fight against this pandemic. And I call attention to my colleagues of the article in the Washington Post just about 2 weeks ago Samantha Power wants to restore U.S. prestige by getting American-made vaccines into arms around the world. We thank you for that. We thank you for that effort. Along with increased funding to fight COVID-19 worldwide, USAID needs more resources to advocate for human rights and democratic values, to combat corruption and democratic backsliding, and to protect against authoritarianism. I am confident that USAID will similarly recommit itself to advancing development specifically for women and mothers and girls around the world, as the chair pointed out, including in family planning and in educational, leadership, and economic opportunities. None of this will matter in the long run, however, if we do not address the existential threat of global climate change. And to that end, I am pleased that USAID is requesting $691 million, an increase of $200 million to help developing countries adapt to climate change, expand clean energy production, and reduce emissions. Ambassador Power, I know that you are a tireless advocate for the world's most vulnerable people, and I hope you know that this committee will be your partner as you lead USAID. The chair will be sure of that. I look forward to our discussion on the administration's budget request and USAID's goals for the coming year. And I thank you for testifying this morning and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Now, Administrator Power, if you could summarize your oral statement in less than 5 minutes. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to our questions. Your full statement, of course, will be included in the record. And after your testimony, I will be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between the majority and minority members. I will then recognize any remaining members in order of their appearance at this committee meeting this morning. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. Administrator Power, please proceed and succeed. Thank you again for being here.
Let's hope for both. Thank you, Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, Chairwoman DeLauro, and members of the subcommittee. Let me start by expressing deep gratitude for the continued bipartisan support for the work we do at USAID. This support for development and humanitarian assistance has saved and improved millions of lives, and it is critically important for advancing U.S. interests around the world. You have long recognized that diplomacy, defense, and development are vital components of our foreign policy, and President Biden does as well, which is reflected in the discretionary budget request and in his decision to elevate the USAID Administrator to become a standing member of the National Security Council. Our investments in development and humanitarian assistance have grown even more necessary in light of today's challenges. And here, let me respond, I know we'll have other occasions, but to Ranking Member Rogers' concerns about the increase in the budget and offer a context for the request. A persistent pandemic that, as we know, has left nearly 3.5 million dead, swelled the ranks of the extreme poor for the first time since the late 1990s. Authoritarian regimes like China and Russia acting more aggressively each year, exploiting not only COVID, but vulnerabilities in our democracies. A rapidly changing climate, sending fiercer storms our way and inflicting droughts, deep freezes, and wildfires upon communities. Mass displacement at its highest since World War II. And just when you think it can't get worse, every day it seems a new horrific crisis is emerging, such as that in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where Ethiopians are facing the worst food insecurity the country has seen since the 1983-84 famine killed over 1 million people. And of course, as was mentioned, against this backdrop, China increasingly using its financial power as leverage to advance its interests. These are obviously not positive developments, but as an American, I am very glad that USAID, the world's premier development agency, is uniquely positioned to confront the world's toughest problems and to catalyze our partners to do the same. The steps we take to combat COVID, climate change, conflict, and other ills make us safer while demonstrating compassion for and cooperation with people all around the world. As has been indicated, when we fight COVID, we reduce the risks of variants that can lead to outbreaks at home. When incomes rise in the developing world, these countries become more self-reliant and less dependent on donor support. When the U.S. delivers aid to those affected by natural disasters, we demonstrate the best of American values and build the type of goodwill that inspires cooperation from our allies. Our investments help support civil society under extreme stress. They address the drivers of violent extremism and the root causes of conflict and migration. They meet the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, build resilience to extreme weather patterns, itself a good investment, meaning we need to spend less humanitarian assistance on the back end, combat infectious diseases, of course, and now especially contribute to a global economic recovery. We know that the enormous level of need far outstrips any one country's ability to meet it, nor do we believe that the United States has to bear all of the responsibility for the world's ills. This request will allow the U.S. to lead on the global stage and to leverage our activities to get our allies and private sector partners to do more. We also need to make ourselves more capable and nimble as an agency, and we are seeking to adapt our systems, processes, and procedures to that end, including by seeking to expand our engagement with the private sector. We also need to build USAID's institutional capacity, given its role as a national security agency. We are focused on our workforce. During the pandemic, many of our staff at home and abroad have been working 24/7 to provide life-saving aid around the world, even while their loved ones are battling COVID-19 at home. Moving forward, we are not seeking to return to the previous status quo, but rather wish to harness the capabilities of our staff and support them in the ways that they need. Underpinning these efforts, Madam Chairwoman, will be a strong focus on creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive USAID. With your support, we will move aggressively to tackle the world's toughest challenges. I look forward to our continued partnership in ensuring that American taxpayer dollars are spent effectively. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Administrator Power. Let me ask you a couple questions on the supply and distribution of vaccines abroad. You know, by increasing the supply of vaccines, it's only useful if we have the means to deploy these doses once they reach vulnerable countries. But with the loss of India's production capacity in the short run, this has created quite a crisis. Of course, I've spoken with Gail Smith and Secretary Blinken in terms of when we'll see a plan for distributing the, 80 million donated doses. And we want to know where this plan is and what are the plans, especially with regard to small countries in our hemisphere and in Africa. We've heard reports that close to 20 million people on the continent of Africa have received one dose. May or may not receive the second dose. So what's USAID doing, and what's your role in making sure that the vaccines are distributed to vulnerable communities, and how is USAID coordinating this on the ground in partner countries?
Great. Thank you so much for the question. And above all, thank you for your personal leadership, but also the committee's leadership in securing the $4 billion donation or capacity to donate to COVAX. That has been extremely significant in the sense that prior to that, COVAX lacked really the kind of capital that it needed to be able to get in the queue with the big pharmaceutical companies who are making these doses. And so you saw, I think probably last week, Congresswoman, a $500 million dose deal, for example, that COVAX did with Moderna. The challenge, of course, is that will not roll out until next year, it looks like. And you alluded to why it is so urgent that we get more doses in the hands of COVAX. There's the obvious just global urgency, but the fact that the Serum Institute of India has had to pull back already 140 million doses that COVAX had expected, and several hundred million doses more that were in the queue to come later in the year and into next year. So COVAX needs supply. That is the gating issue. That is why President Biden made the announcement that you alluded to of donating 80 million doses. Now, you asked about the plan. It's a great and fair question. I just was on the phone with Gail Smith before this hearing commenced, talking about just that. What we are doing as the country selection procedure takes hold and finalizes in the interagency, and I believe me, that is an area of great focus. We Usaid are very focused on ensuring that countries are ready to receive vaccines. And so we have spent of the ARP money, I think there's 75 million that has been invested in strengthening health systems to make sure that with UNICEF, PAHO, especially PAHO in our hemisphere, that countries, when those vaccines come off the planes, that they are that the recipients have been identified, especially those who need second shots because of India pulling back its supply. Because that, just to underscore that point that you made, the issue is that COVAX delivered a whole set of first shots, anticipating then that the Serum Institute would continue supplying. And so now you have, again, this population that has one but not two, which is suboptimal to say the least.
Okay, have a minute remaining. Let me just ask you about the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy with USAID. I'm very pleased to see that you are developing a strategy. Oh boy, what, because this has been quite an uphill battle over the years as it relates to inclusion and diversity. So how is this going to roll out, and how will USAID be held accountable to achieve these very worthy goals laid out in your strategy?
Thank you. Well, let me just say I embrace the premise, which is the strategy is, it's strategy is as good as the results on the ground, as they say. And, just digging into this issue, and I know this is something that you're very knowledgeable about, but seeing the GAO study, I'm just reading it here, that racial and ethnic minorities as of 2018 were 31 to 41% less likely to be promoted in the civil service. So we have data that really causes, I think, significant concern. Partly it's a recruitment issue. I think raising the profile of the recruitment that we are doing at historical Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. It's sitting down with the Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus. I talked to Congressman Meeks about this also a day or two ago. Just how do we get the word out that we want to recruit starting early in high schools, colleges, and graduate schools. If you wait till graduate school, you're likely not going to be able to really broaden the pool. So we have to start earlier, and we have internship programs, including the PAIN internship and others that you're familiar with, but we need to do more. Then, and I know my time is out, but retaining has been a challenge, and that's about culture and promotion and other methods like that. So I count on you to hold me accountable. I will hold myself accountable. We're digging into the metrics now and trying to set reasonable goals, calibrated. Of course, a barrier analysis is where I want to start to understand what is standing in the way of creating the agency that we need.
Okay, but thank you very much, Administrative Power. And maybe we'll have a briefing or drill down with some members of the committee whose focus has been this issue for several years. Now let me yield to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Power, we all know that Russian President Putin and his aggressive foreign policy and authoritarian approach to governance seeks to weaken NATO, undermine our European partners, and challenge the American and Western democratic system. What role do you see USAID playing in seeking to support democracy and market-based economies that are under assault by Moscow?
Thank you, Congressman. As you might recall, when I was UN ambassador, my time in New York coincided with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its interference in our election, its carpet bombing of Aleppo, along with the Syrian armed forces. So I'm very familiar with Russian aggression and very disturbed by it. I'd offer a few thoughts. First, to say just how compounded the challenge posed by Russia has been by the extent to which China has stepped up its activities in terms of spreading misinformation, providing technological surveillance capacity to governments, really helping fuel democratic backsliding right alongside with Russia. So now I think it's important. They're different, but there are some overlapping tactics that we have to stand up to. And you asked about USAID specifically, so let me offer just a few thoughts there. First, I think one of the things that I've only been in the job a few weeks, but that I'm digging into is our democracy programming and our governance programming. Given that we're in the 15th year of freedom in decline around the world, it seems to me we have to ask ourselves the question of to your opening statement as well, are our programs optimal for this moment and for these threats? You know, some of these programs might have been conceived of in a different era before Putin or President Xi began, being as assertive and aggressive when it comes to undermining democracy abroad. I think, for example, fighting misinformation and disinformation, which is one of the things that these actors do, both by flooding the zone with their own propaganda and by backing illiberal actors within countries who are, for example, denigrating civil society, cracking down on independent media and so forth. So I would put misinformation, I think that's important. I think second, anti-corruption is going to be a huge area of emphasis for me and for President Biden. And I've already appointed an anti-corruption coordinator who is a terrific, seasoned US government hand to think about how we look at corruption. We've always thought about corruption in terms of not wanting our foreign aid to go to waste, and that's incredibly important. But what kind of programs can we support? Because the Achilles heel of Russian-backed elements and illiberal elements around the world, I think, is the extent to which they are squirreling away their citizens' resources, whether natural resources or other funds. And then the last thing I'd say, sir, is just real quick, is that there are bright spots in the world like that in Sudan. And so I just thank this body and you and others who have supported our effort to secure resources to be able to support Sudan at this time of fragile transition.
Let me turn to Belarus and Russian allies. The hijacking of a Ryanair plane and the detention of a dissident blogger, a frontal assault on democracy. German Prime Minister Angela Merkel has said questions remain about the role of Russia in the forced landing of the plane by Belarus. What information about a Russian role, if any, can you provide to us?
I don't have anything additional to share at this point, but I'm happy to dig into it when I get back to the office and to reach out to you later today. But I've been preparing for these hearings and have not been read into what we might know in other channels.
Well, what can we do? For example, should we increase support for journalists, both inside and outside Belarus and Russia, targeting a Russian-speaking audience? Go ahead.
Sorry, sir. That is what I've been digging into since this outrageous action is what are the ramifications for our programming? I mean, right now our emphasis is on diplomatic pressure to try to bring about the release of Rahman and his colleagues. But this is a structural problem. I mean, extraterritorial apprehensions are becoming and harms caused extraterritorially. So not just arrests, but the kinds of poisonings and other things that we have seen. I mean, these norms are being challenged recklessly by the Russian Federation and by the Chinese government as well. So I think that's a broader conversation. In terms of our assistance, yes, we're digging in to see how much more we can do for independent media, including those actors who are now unfortunately in exile, but still trying to reach the brave Belarusian people who have stood up and are not giving up on democracy in their country.
Thank you.
Now let me yield to Ms. Main, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you, Administrator Powers, for being here today. We are so thrilled to see you in this role and look forward to working with you on a host of issue. I just wanted to backtrack for a quick second about the issue raised by Chairwoman Barbara Lee on the diversity of the workforce, and would encourage that you also add CAPAC, the Congressional Asian Caucus, in your conversations as well. My question is similarly about, actually, sorry, I'm going to go to another question. I wanted to take a minute to address an issue close to my heart: water, sanitation, and hygiene. While countries around the world await vaccine distributions, we can't take our eye off the ball to ensure that there is adequate non-emergency humanitarian wash programming, including sustainable hand washing stations in marketplaces, schools, travel hubs, and on key travel routes. I'm also committed to ensuring that menstrual hygiene products are included as a part of PPE donations made by the US government to other countries. In many countries, including India, female doctors and nurses report bleeding through their PPE because they couldn't waste it when changing their menstrual products, and report increases in UTIs due to lack of access to bathrooms. Can you give us an update on the drafting of the next global water strategy and how issues like climate change, water scarcity, gender, and COVID can be integrated in the strategy? And how can we be helpful in ensuring that the strategy reflects the current needs on the ground?
Thank you. If I could, would like to get back to you on the WASH strategy, as I don't have details just off the top of my head like I like to. Give me a little time in the job, and I'll be able to summon those. I have focused on the menstrual health and hygiene issue just in the last few weeks, because I just agree with you so wholeheartedly that this is so integral to the dignity and empowerment of women and girls, and just such an important issue, and it just hasn't gotten the attention that it is needed over time in the humanitarian or development sectors. We have just, in honor of Menstrual Hygiene Day, which as it happens is tomorrow, Usaid will be launching a new standard definition of menstrual health and hygiene, which will set clear expectations for multi-sectoral investments in product access, improvement of sanitation and water, accurate information, not just for women and girls, and efforts to confront menstruation-related taboos and stigmas, which we know persist around the world. So if I could get back to you on the WASH strategy and the timing of that and content of that, I'd be grateful.
Sure, thank you so much. And my other question is, wanted to know what steps USAID is taking to ensure that its program take into account risks of gender-based violence at the onset of emergencies, including COVID. 3 members of this subcommittee, myself, Ms. Franco, and Mr. Diaz-Balart, have introduced the Safe from the Start Act, which would codify programs that ensure quality services for survivors from the very onset of emergencies, including pandemics.
Again, especially from my time at USUN, when I pushed for much greater emphasis in peacekeeping missions and female peacekeepers and police to be included, this is an issue very near and dear to my heart. I think what we're looking at is not only separate, dedicated gender-based violence programming of the kind that USAID has supported for a long time, but what does it mean to integrate gender-based violence accountability into, for example, our WASH and sanitation program, into our economic growth programming, into, as you mentioned, humanitarian emergency response. I think USAID has come a long way. One thing I have to mention, I know we're short on time, but just is the sexual exploitation and abuse challenge, where it's not just a question of, are emergency responders looking out for this on the ground, but now we have to deal with the recognition that emergency responders and those most counted on to support people in their hour of greatest need are themselves in many credible cases accused of committing wrongdoing and sexual exploitation and abuse themselves. And so USAID is working really hard now to write into its contracts requirements as it relates to sexual exploitation and abuse, to make sure that zero tolerance is not just a slogan, but something that is lived at every stage of our contracting process.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Diaz-Bayart.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Ambassador, you talked about the importance of accountability to hold you accountable and to hold yourself accountable. I've got some serious concerns. You have a record both in words and actions that is, I want to be respectful, but is concerning. I'm concerned of your description of the Israeli occupation. I'm concerned of your reference to the need of, quote, alienating a domestic constituency of tremendous political and financial import, end of quote. That's referring to pro-Israel groups in the United States. You also have further said that the U.S. should provide, quote, less automatic deference to special interests, again, referring to those same groups. Those are comments that have been characterized by some as being anti-Semitic. And equally as concerning is your failure to oppose an anti-Israel resolution in the UN in 2016. That, by the way, is an unprecedented, shameful betrayal of Israel without precedent in the history of the relationship between the United States and Israel. So, having that as your history in, again, both words and actions, do you still stand by those statements? And do you still stand by your action in front of the UN of abandoning Israel? Or do you now admit that those were mistakes? And if you'd care to explain if they were your new attitude.
Thank you, Congressman. I hope we can talk at some point about human rights work and humanitarian work that we can do together, as we did, I think, on a couple occasions when I was UN ambassador. With regard to my actions at the UN, I'd just like to share, because it sounds like you're familiar only with a portion of what we were able to do.
No, Madam
in my
Chair,
time, if I may, sir, if I may just.
No, but I want you to answer.
You've accused me.
I don't want you to, if you might, Ambassador, I don't want you to go into other wonderful things that you may have done. I specifically am referring to some specific statements that you have made about pro-Israel groups in the United States, and specifically this unprecedented betrayal of Israel in front of the UN. We can talk at length about all the wonderful things that you've done in history, but I'm talking about those specific issues. If you would please, were those mistakes, or do you stand by those decisions?
I secure the recognition of Yom Kippur as a UN holiday. I convened the first ever General Assembly session.
You don't want to answer the specific question I'm asking.
We'll come to your question, sir.
All right.
If I may, I get some time to speak as well. I convened the first ever General Assembly session condemning anti-Semitism in the history of the United Nations in the same chamber that the Zionism is Racism resolution was passed. I secured Israel's membership in caucus groups from which it had been excluded for its entire time within the United Nations. With regard to the resolution that you ask about, it was a resolution calling on all sides not to do things that would make a two-state solution less likely, including the building of settlements, but also incitement and violence of the kind perpetrated by extremists and terrorist groups.
And so you stand with that decision to, in essence, unprecedented decision, something that no previous administration, either Democrat or Republican, had ever done. You stand by your decision to abandon Israel at the UN.
What I'm focused on now is supporting something that seems ever more elusive, especially in light of the conflict and horrors and trauma that people have gone through on both sides in the last days. So that includes ensuring that USAID is in a position to deliver humanitarian assistance, to honor the legacy also of Congresswoman Lowy in the Middle East Partnership for Peace Initiative, to generate reconciliation or to support reconciliation programs, both between Israelis and Palestinians and between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, as those tensions have also been exacerbated in recent days.
I appreciate that, Ambassador. I've tried to give you time, but again, I was fearful, and which is why I had to interrupt you, but that you would not answer the question. You've yet refused to answer the question, whether you stand by that decision and by the statements that you have made.
President Obama makes the decision. You work for the president, and but the resolution is one that includes the tenets that administrations in both parties have stood behind for a long time, namely support for a two-state solution. Thank you, sir.
Well, again, I yield back, Madam Chairwoman, but again, I'll try to see if I can get those answers, those questions answered one of these days. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Let me yield now to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Ambassador. We're very happy to have you in this position and look forward to working with you in many ways. The budget for our bill, our State Department Foreign Operations Bill, which includes, of course, various aspects of foreign aid, is a reminder of how many aspects there are, from global health to focus on education, especially girls' education, to economic empowerment, climate resilience. So much in the way of complementary and sometimes competing channels for assistance. I want to return to the answer you were giving to Mr. Rogers about the place of governance, democratic development, the place of that aid stream alongside these others. Of course, in many ways, governance is basic to everything else. And yet we know sometimes governance is harder to influence, harder to shape, and certainly it's harder to measure the results. I'm the co-chair of the House Democracy Partnership, a bipartisan commission which works with developing democracies all over the world, a couple of dozen countries. It ranges from key strategic partners like Kenya, Indonesia, Peru, to the struggling smaller countries that this country has a particular relationship with: Liberia, Timor-Leste, Kosovo. Perhaps you're familiar with our work because the work of AID is really supportive of our work. We actually couldn't do it without the partnership we have with the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, with the USAID's support. So we find ourselves often in these countries valuing the work of USAID, and sometimes providing some feedback about the kind of emphasis that's needed on legislative strengthening, in particular, and working with these parliaments, and sometimes urging that one aspect or another of aid shouldn't be prematurely terminated. So we really do engage with your agency, and I just want to ask you about your view of this governance support. Democracy promotion in some quarters got a bad name. I mean, there are some methods and approaches that are, of course, more effective than others. We take a collaborative approach, one that does not presume to impose our system or our solutions, but certainly we do think our 225-year history is relevant, and our partner countries find that as well. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on governance support and perhaps legislative strengthening within governance support as a mission of the agency.
Thank you, Congressman. I have learned about the House Partnership Initiative, and I think what I like about it is that, frankly, what we're seeing more and more of are illiberal networks, again, funded often by sort of extreme forces, trying to, anti-Semitic forces that are anti-LGBTQ or anti-minority. You see the networks actually getting strengthened across countries, taking advantage of echo chambers and social media and other avenues, but there's even financing, again, that is going across borders, and sort of this more virtuous cooperation, right, where we're comparing notes, for example, on some of the issues I mentioned earlier, like how to fight misinformation, how to stand up for the rule of law, and doing so in a spirit of humility, given that we know, that we face many challenges here at home. I think it's incredibly important. And, I'd love to talk more about it. I also think networks of judges and people who constitute independent judiciaries, defenders, public defenders, or defense attorneys and prosecutors as well. We see a growing kind of majoritarianism where, even in democracies, the checks on majoritarianism are kind of melting away, whether legislatively or in terms of enforcement of constitutional provisions. So I think what you're doing is really important, and I think this question of not only elections, but what are the institutions that have to be strengthened that protect minority rights and protect the rule of law and protect civilian control over the military, the tenets of liberal democracy and of respect for human rights. I think that's where we want to dig in more to see, whether our programming needs to be adjusted in light of the assault on some of these institutions being undertaken in different quarters.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me yield now to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you holding this hearing. Ambassador Power, would you prefer to be called Ambassador, Madam Ambassador, or Administrator Power? I'm curious about that. It's a simple question.
Normally Samantha, but Administrator, I suppose, for the purposes of this hearing. But I go back and forth. I debate with my kids, when I'm trying to get them to show me respect.
All right. Administrator it is. Let me preface my questions with just a comment. I believe that a key priority, a central role, if you will, is that of regenerative agriculture and conservation as it leads to community well-being, sustainability, as well as stability. That's an architectural framework for me, but I want to address three issues in the time that we have in this round. First is MEPA, the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which you referenced earlier. Second, a small program that has big implications, farmer to farmer. And finally, China and vaccines. This is a delicate issue right now, obviously, given the trauma in the Middle East and the sensitivities and the difficulties. However, for many years, I carried this bill, the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. Was so pleased that our former chair, Lowy, wanted to shepherd that into law and took the leadership of that last year. So the question becomes, any roadmap for peace has to have a foundation, and that foundation has to be built on trust. And this is the heart of MEPA, if you will, traditional people-to-people exchange programs, but also a new instrument using the Development Finance Corporation, a little bit of subsidy of public monies, to create the conditions for equity investments by persons of both sides, to create the long-term continuity of economic well-being that's harder to unwind whenever you have politically explosive situations. So the question is, how are you working with the State Department and the Development Finance Corporation to implement MEPA as a central policy for diplomacy, particularly in this delicate moment? I think this is timely. I recognize the sensitivity of it. If you could address that in 1 minute, I'll probably interrupt you to try to get my other questions in, but there you go.
Why don't I just be very brief on that, which is just, again, to applaud the program, the spirit behind it. As there is more and more separation among communities, these programs, several of which I visited while on a trip I took to Israel as UN ambassador, indispensable. You asked specifically about our plans to move out on it. One of the first things I need to do is constitute an advisory council according to the legislation. And then we need to move out to ramp up our programming, especially again in light of recent events. So on the specifics, I can get back to you, but again, there's a structural component that I think needs to be built out in the very, very near term. So any ideas you have for and others have for how to constitute that council, I'd be very open to, or again on specific programs,
Yeah, we look forward to trying to give constructive input in the spirit of what we intended in the law. And I think you're right. A quick implementation of this is absolutely necessary to begin to rebuild some trust, but with programs that have viability and long-term continuity that build that foundation. So let me move to farmer right quick. And again, back to this idea of how do we leverage technical expertise and goodwill in America from our citizenry who are not going to be able to join USAID, are not going to become members of the Foreign Service, or who aren't going to be able to spend significant times overseas as a volunteer and other sort. We're working on a concept right now, the Conservation Corps, but the earlier implementation of Farmer to Farmer is exactly that idea. Here's the problem. It's a USDA program given to USAID, which is then shipped out to NGOs, fragmented, not a holistic strategic approach from my perspective. Can you consolidate that effort and make it one of the premier programs for regenerative agriculture and conservation around the world?
I love this program, and I didn't know about this program as a private citizen before I got into my job. But the fact that we have 20,000 farmers who volunteered, and I think it's 136 million people in more than 115 countries have benefited from this. It didn't even shut down, hasn't shut down under COVID. They've started doing this virtually, which I think creates all kinds of possibilities for a remote version of this.
Could be a component of the Foreign Ag Service. It could be embedded in embassies with much more structure, shepherded by your agency. There's a lot more to talk about here, and then I need to get to vaccines in China, vaccine diplomacy. I'll have to do it in the next round. Thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, now I will yield to Ms. Frankel if she is on.
Oh boy.
Are you?
Oh my God. I've been on this is my third device. I've made it. I'm in a frazzle. Administrator, congratulations. It's so great to have you in this position. I want to talk to you about women and girls. I know you obviously have an interest. The past year, really last few years have been tough with the global gag order, with the pandemic. And so my first question is plans for women and young people to receive accurate information about and access to a full range of contraceptive methods, and increasing the U.S. funding for international family planning and reproductive health, and your knowledge, if any, yet of some of the setbacks over the last few years, because I know a lot of clinics shut down. That's question one. The other one, related, really has to do with expanding women economic empowerment and education. I know also, I read a study that the gender gap between men and women have been set back by a generation internationally. Just interested in knowing what you're doing to scaling up funding for women's rights organizations, and do you have the staffing and training needed to ensure that gender policy is integrated across all programs? That's a lot of questions. Okay, do the best you can.
Thank you. That's all I can ever do. But let me just in terms of ramping up programs and partnerships that were scaled back or cut, I think we're in the position of doing that now. I can follow up with you in terms of details of what that delta is. But at the same time, we're continuing to follow the law and the regulations that remain in place. But the restrictions on funding definitely caused us to scale back programs. And I think it's important to state the context, the fact that there are 218 million women globally who have a need for modern contraception and are not able to access it. I mean, this is incredibly important in thinking about economic development and thinking about security. And we can see where voluntary family planning is in place and people can access these resources, the knock-on positive development effects across just so many vectors. Then the other context for your question, which of course, but is just the uptick in gender-based violence, the fact that not only are there 1.6 billion kids around the world out of school because of the pandemic, but there are estimates that 400 million girls will not go back to school, but for intervention and programs that will support their return. So just as we've seen disparate impact on women, even in our own country, as it relates to the pandemic, I think we're seeing that all around the world. And that, again, I come back to Ranking Member Rogers' very important questions about the scale of the budget requests and our budget constrained environment. It's just, the only way I can think about it is it's as if a meteorite has hit the planet and so much of the progress that had been made on so many vectors, and again, Congresswoman Lee mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, so many of those just inching upward in terms of education, in terms of women's empowerment, in terms of women's representation in parliament, in terms of sanitation, in terms of food security, and just so many of those set back. And so to try to mitigate the damage and get back on track, given the amount of taxpayer money we have already invested in these programs, I think this is just an inflection point that's really important. And you know, this is Exhibit A of why surging these programs is essential right now.
From what you can tell, do you yet have the staffing and the training needed to ensure that the gender policy is integrated through all the programs?
Well, we're reviewing the gender policy that we inherited, and we'll want to consult with you and others about that. You know, this is not a desire to replace it wholesale, but the last gender policy didn't include LGBTQI people, as I understand it, and the process to comprise it or to constitute it was not as transparent and inclusive as I think we are looking to do. So on the policy, there's getting that right and getting it mainstreamed. I think on staffing, we have some exciting people coming on board, but again, there is so much expertise within the Usaid career workforce that my sense is that we're in a good place. But if you have other insight, you know, please bring it to me as I'm just digging into each of these questions.
Yeah, thank you. And let you know, there were two very good bipartisan efforts, the Women's Entrepreneur and Economic Empowerment Act and the Women, Peace and Security Act. So there's really has been some bipartisan efforts to advance women and girls. I look forward to discussing that more. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Now I will yield to Mr. Reschenbauer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it. And Administrator Powers, thanks for being here today. Administrator, would you agree that through published research that has recently come out that scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology conducted risky experiments with the novel coronaviruses from bats? Would you agree with that statement?
This is beyond my area of expertise. So I think on things related to the Virology Institute, I, like President Biden, am eager to see, you know, what our investigation turns up. But it
Sure. Well, I can tell you that in a 2015 study, it was actually entitled "A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence." That was funded in part by USAID grant money that utilized what's called gain-of-function research. Additionally, I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to the news, but just in recent weeks, especially this week, USAID and NIH denied authorizing this type of dangerous research. With that information I just provided you, do you support an investigation into organizations, including Eagle Health Alliance, to determine if they conducted unauthorized gain-of-function research?
I think I need to say a word about the programming that you're referring to. I mean, as part of the PREDICT surveillance effort to try to anticipate viruses of the nature that has caused such devastation in the United States and around the world. Over a period of 10 years, USAID, you know, did support programming in the Institute, but not of the kind that you're referring to. And
Administrator, with all due respect, the question was very simple. Do you or do you not support an investigation into this money going into the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study gain of function research? Is a simple yes or no.
If I could just finish the point that I was making is that
no, because you're running all over the place. It's a simple yes or no. If you're not going to answer that, answer me this: USAID currently funding or not funding gain of function research elsewhere?
I will have to look into that and get back to you.
All right. All right. In 2019, President Trump ended USAID activities in China, including the PREDICT funding that you mentioned. Did you support this? Do you support that?
Did I?
Do you support ending gain of function research in China?
I've been in the job for a few weeks. I want to dig into that question. I mean, I think given the.
So do you support then USAID money going to China? I mean, this is a very basic elementary question.
Excuse me?
This is a very elementary question. You either support USAID money going to China or you don't. It's very simple. Do you or do you not?
Right now, I think that we are looking at what the right posture is with regard to China all around the world. And as part of that, as part of that review, I think we'll be looking very hard at the question of whether there's any scenario in which USAID would be doing anything in China.
All right. Would you support USAID funding going to CCP labs like it has in the past?
I've been in my job for a few weeks. I need to dig into all of this. I could read you where the money is going. I mean, we know that money was going. You know more
than the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We know that EcoHealth Alliance sent at least $600,000 in NIAID grants. I mean, this is very basic information. It's public. It's been public for about a year now. I found it astounding that you're finding out about it now.
No, I'm not finding out about it now. I'm well aware of the PREDICT programming and so forth, but I know that you're very focused on the single issue. It turns out USAID has programs in a whole host of areas in a whole host of countries.
Right. Well, in the last 20 seconds, let me ask you this: yes or no? Do you support a prohibition of federal funding going to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer these questions without doing further.
It's absolutely amazing. You're the administrator. We've been sending money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We've been doing it for years, since 2015. I just read you the study, and you can't answer a basic question, yes or no, if we should be sending more money to a Chinese communist lab. That's outstanding.
That's not the question that you posed.
Madam Chair, I object to this bullying of this witness. Madam Chair, this member is bullying this witness. I object.
I'm asking legit questions, and the administrator has failed to answer.
Excuse me. I'm going to yield now to Representative Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Administrator Powers. Thank you so much for your patience and for joining us today. I want to also join my colleagues in thanking you for suspending aid to the government of El Salvador last week. We cannot continue to give taxpayers hard-earned dollars in foreign assistance to governments that misuse it to advance their own corrupt interests and act counter to our own policy goals. We need to be clear-eyed about our partners in the region, and unfortunately, this is not unique to El Salvador. I don't need to go into detail about concerns with narco trafficking, co-conspirator number 4 in Honduras. In Guatemala, despite strong calls from the international community and civil society, Guatemala proceeded with a totally non-transparent process to stack the Constitutional Court with judges who have clear conflicts of interest and links to corruption. In one of the court's first moves, it overturned an earlier ruling and allowed a controversial law targeting civil society to move forward. And just last week, the Guatemala court dropped a graft charge against former President Perez Molina. And 2 anti-corruption prosecutors have been arrested in the middle of major prison riots that are currently happening in Guatemala. It is more evident than ever that we cannot trust these governments to administer aid to fight corruption and bolster the rule of law. So, Administrator Power, given these events, are you also evaluating assistance to the governments of Guatemala and Honduras in a similar manner to your assessment of our aid in El Salvador? And what assistance does USAID currently give to the Attorney General and the judicial sector, including the Constitutional Court, the High-Risk Court, and penal courts?
Thank you. I'm still recovering.
I know. I'm so sorry about that. We really want to focus on the really important issues here.
It's okay. But just I feel I need to just for the record say that we did not fund, that USA did not fund the research to which he was referring. But I think what's really important context to offer is that the reason that the prior administration and the Obama administration thought it a good idea to be active in this lab was precisely because of concerns about biosecurity, wet markets, and the risk of animal to human transmission of virus. So the notion that this was a program abetting, what the Chinese government was doing, as distinct from actually looking out for our interests and conducting surveillance is absurd.
And the people in this committee that are not involved in the politics of the last 4 years understand that. And we only have this pandemic that we're in, the reason why we are working remotely, to understand the importance of the U.S. being a part of that program. So thank you for clarifying that.
Well, I think, again, had I been able to just, and thank you for letting me finish a sentence, to be able to explain why it would be that there'd be any connection between USAID and this lab that of course is definitely needs to be subject to a transparent and much more independent investigation than has occurred so far. With regard to your question, so first of all, thank you for mentioning the decision to reroute funding away from the Attorney General's office, the Supreme Court, and the Civilian National Police. These were the entities that had been politicized by the president, we thought, and I think you agree, inconsistent with the rule of law and the constitutional requirements. I think we are now in the process just of building up our programming in these 3 countries because it was, as you know, suspended or terminated in many cases under the last administration. So in the interest of trying to get at the root causes of migration, one of which is a lack of rule of law and corruption, and of course, great physical and personal insecurity that citizens in these countries feel, alongside the economic conditions and push factors that cause people to flee. We're just digging into, again, what those rule of law programs should look like. So I can get back to you on specifics about now what the residuals are, given the rerouting to civil society of the money that we announced last week.
Thank you. I'm out of time, and I hope we have an opportunity.
I'll add another 50 seconds, given that Administrator Power clarified the last.
I'll come back in a second round. Thank you so much, Chairwoman Barbara Lee.
Okay. To Representative Wexton. Representative Wexton. Representative Wexton, I'm yielding. Okay, Representative Wexton. Can you hear me?
Madam Chairwoman, and thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I was having audio issues. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Administrator Power, for joining us today. I'd like to speak to you for a moment about Gaza. Now, I'm happy to see us taking a more active role in the region, and I'm grateful that the ceasefire is holding. But as you know, now that the shelling has stopped, now comes the hard part, which is preventing a full-on humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Food, fuel, water, and medicine are all in short supply. What little critical infrastructure there was damaged in the bombings, and tens of thousands of Palestinians were displaced in just the last couple of weeks, most of them children. And as you know, it's the hopelessness and lack of opportunity that helps fuel the cycle of violence. So Secretary Blinken's announcement this week of $360 million in assistance to the Palestinian people for emergency shelter, food, and healthcare, as well as $75 million in development and economic assistance is welcome news. But what are some of the steps that we're taking to ensure that this money actually benefits the people of Gaza and does not go to help fuel terrorism in the region?
Thank you so much. Just underscore the premise of your question, which is how important this assistance is. Right now, we're working with the Catholic Relief Services and the World Food Program to provide I think more than $15 million in immediate medical supplies. We are supporting the East Jerusalem Hospital Network and trying to use sort of cash and food vouchers that go directly to citizens, pivoting programs also to water and sanitation because there are real concerns about disease outbreaks. And then, of course, there are displaced persons, given the destruction that occurred, whose needs also we're looking out for. You asked about vetting. It's incredibly important. We know we have to be faithful to the taxpayer above all, and that we need to prevent these resources from falling into the wrong hands. Everything in that region is vetted in accordance with the Taylor Force Act. And of course, that's in order to prevent anything being diverted to Hamas. In the case of the Taylor Force Act, it also cannot benefit the Palestinian Authority. There is the most vigilant and stringent scrutiny of our prime awardees, but also those sub-grantees or grantees under the prime awards. And so, again, I think people can have confidence that this is going to the intended beneficiaries. It certainly, we have systems in place.
Thank you. Now, Secretary Blinken pledged to address the underlying conditions. What does that mean, and how is it different from ways that we traditionally supported the Palestinian people? What does that mean by addressing the underlying conditions?
I mean, I think it means the development programs and not just the emergency humanitarian responses, but also programs along the lines of what we discussed in the prior exchange on the Middle East Partnership for Peace Initiative, because I think those programs that enhance, expand contacts across communities, contacts that are fewer these days than they might have been 10 years ago. For example, as more separation is happening, I think those programs are incredibly important. So as
related to that, it's clear that children suffer the most during this entire cycle of violence. The UN Children's Fund reported that 1 in 3 children in Gaza required mental health support even before the latest round of violence, and now it's been exacerbated since this most recent violence in Gaza. How is USAID supporting the need for mental health services for children in the region?
On the specific programming, I'd have to get back to you, but it's incredibly important, and always what our emergency responses look to do in the first round of dispersal of funds. But again,
can you give us an update on USAID's West Bank and Gaza mission? Where are we at in terms of staffing levels and restarting programs that were halted under the previous administration? Can you give us some kind of update of where we are?
Our new mission director arrived in country last week, well-timed, given the emergency needs. On the holds, I believe Senator Graham and Risch lifted their holds on a significant subset of what had been held up in the development context. Again, we were able to move humanitarian money from the beginning of the recent Gaza conflict. So I believe there is still some programming being held, but the sanitation programming, the support for East Jerusalem Hospital Network, all of that funding is now being spent.
Good, and I hope that that mission is able to do the right kind of vetting to ensure that this money doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So thank you very much. I see that my time has expired. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Let me yield now to Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Administrator Power, for being before us today. I know that in the skinny budget, you have requested $58 billion, which is a 10%, a $5.4 billion or 10% increase from last year. However, the hurricane seasons, as projected to be a very serious one for Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, FEMA has substantially increased their budget in preparation for this. And I know that you engage countries with the post-hurricane or the post-natural disaster work that needs to happen in many countries across the world. I just find that the increase is not high enough, considering the level of demand that may be out there in the world, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think that there are hotspots all over the planet that need to be addressed, and this is just a drop in the bucket. I know there's this misconception out there that we're giving away the store, with regards to foreign aid, when in fact that is not the case. It's probably less than 1% of our entire budget. And I think for us to be competitive, right? For us to be competitive with China and other countries that are clearly making a move in our backyard, in the hemisphere, we gotta really come up with substantial help for these countries. So that's one question. Do you think that there could be a substantial increase in that? And second is regarding vaccine distribution. I know that vaccine diplomacy is important, and we're getting, they're eating our lunch out there, and we're very late. And even with the UN's program, they're extremely late. And we need to be there because those countries are being ravaged right now. People are dying from COVID. They'll never get this if we're absent. I think we need to be there. And we wrote a letter to the White House asking for the Central American countries and the Caribbean countries, where you get a big influx back and forth to the Northeast coast and the rest of the U.S. to get the excess vaccines first. So I wanted to know where you were on those two questions, the funding piece and then the vaccine distribution piece.
Thank you, sir. The number of humanitarian emergencies that we are confronting every year is increasing. I mean, we now have more conflicts happening in the world than at any point since the end of the Cold War. I mentioned in my opening statement, more displaced persons since Hitler, since World War II. And you mentioned just the natural disasters, the climate emergencies that are compounding that. There's an uptick almost on a graph. You can just see the straight line going up the vector, going very much in the wrong direction. It is also the case that the U.S. has been more generous every year, and we seek to leverage our dollars to try to get other donor nations to do more, and that's what I would intend to do if this discretionary request is granted. I mentioned also trying to build out the infrastructure at Usaid to get our private sector where there's a lot of generosity, and then also a lot of enlightened self-interest as well, recognizing that we need to strengthen countries internationally, and that over time helps build markets for U.S. goods. So again, the need outpaces what any one country can do, but you're right that it is very, very difficult right now. I must say, our humanitarians at USAID, I don't envy their jobs, because every day they're deciding about how to allocate a fixed amount of resources between an imminent famine in Yemen, the recent hurricanes, let's say in Central America, an imminent potential famine in Ethiopia in the Tigray region, and this is all against the backdrop of us also experiencing more extreme weather events domestically. So this is very challenging. With regard to vaccines, I would only say, because we've had an exchange on this already, that I know the goal, and President Biden indicated this, is for there to be more surplus supply made available in the months ahead. So right now we're focused on this 80 million, which is what he's announced publicly, but we're of course looking at domestic needs. As we make more progress domestically, we're now over the 50% of adults being fully vaccinated. We have this ambitious.
What about Latin America and the Caribbean being the first sort of like location where you will
I
send
think
this?
the country allocation procedure is underway at the moment. There's of course a great interest in looking out for our friends in Latin America, but again, the specifics have not yet been decided upon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. Okay, we're going to go now to our second round, which will be limited to 3 minutes per member. And let me just remind our members to please treat our witness with respect. Let me ask you, Administrative Power, a question with regard to Cuba. Now, on this committee, this subcommittee, there are differences of opinion as it relates to Cuba. But I have long supported the reestablishment of our relationship with Cuba and remain deeply committed to restoring U.S.-Cuba diplomatic ties. The policies of the previous administration punished both Cuban and American citizens alike, but also played right into the hands of China and their strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, I understand that the Biden administration is currently reviewing its policy options toward Cuba, though not nearly as quickly as I had expected or wanted. I wanted to find out from yourself if USAID is contributing toward this policy review, and can we expect a decision fairly soon, or if not, when? And also, since 1996, Congress has appropriated over $350 million in funding for democracy efforts in Cuba, including $20 million in each SFOP's bill since 2014. And so I'm wondering if this is something that you will be reviewing as it relates to this funding, and how has it helped Cuban civil society or empowered human rights activists? And could we build, do you see us building any better ties with the Cuban people by supporting NGOs working in other sectors such as health and education? Can you unmute, Administrator? Yeah.
Apologies. You can add that to your clock. Apologies. No, simply to say that I don't have any insight at this moment about the review or the timing of the review. In terms of our programming, which is more within my ambit, USAID has been responsible, I think, for around 6 million of the 20 million that you reference. So far, that programming, as I understand it, has gone to a diverse range of actors, independent activists, meeting basic needs for political prisoners. You still have NGOs in Cuba defending those who've been arrested, and so actually continuing to try to work to fight persecution. So I will look into that programming. I think the question of how to do work in social service sectors, given the government and the government's repression of citizens, I think that makes that challenging. But again, I'd want to dig into the specifics of our 6 million, and that's a conversation.
And let me just make this statement. I think given the opportunities we're continuing to miss, now we see China and Russia with regard to vaccine distribution in Cuba, and it would just seem to me, once again, we're missing an opportunity to engage with the country where we should be, right next to our own country, and allowing other countries such as China and Russia to weigh in early, unfortunately, in this pandemic. Now, I would like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Ambassador from Capitol Hill, it appears as though China will be one of the primary imperatives of the Biden administration's foreign policy. Your predecessor, Mark was determined to make USA just an aid implementer but a policy player in the U.S. strategy to counter malign Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. How do you view the role of USAID within the interagency on our broad China strategy? Is the agency part of our national security infrastructure, or is your mission more narrowly focused on merely delivering assistance to countries in need with reference to the China challenge?
I think that, first of all, USAID is very focused on democracy programming, on support for civil societies. We've talked about anti-corruption efforts, strengthening elections. We talked about the House Partnership Initiative and strengthening legislatures and the rule of law. So there's a dimension, given that China and its programs stand in opposition to that, where by definition there is tension. We want to see more democracies in the world and more human rights in the world, and they want to see the world looking more like China. So that's one dimension. But I think much beyond that, the United States has, and I think USAID programming really shows this, a set of comparative advantages over the Chinese model for development. And I think I see this very similar to my predecessor, Mark Green, where we support a free and open digital infrastructure. We support governments being held accountable to their people. We want countries to move towards self-reliance. That was a big flagship, as you know, signature approach by Mark Green, which I very much agree with. China takes the other approach, right? In loaning money and in charging exorbitant debt, that leaves countries, much more under pressure from China. And we see this at the United Nations, where China, in a transactional way, says, okay, we've given you this loan, now we need you to vote with us to dial back this human rights norm. So we just operate in a totally different way. And I think the hunger also for US private sector investment is something that the Development Finance Corporation and we, in trying to strengthen regulatory environments to create more hospitable climates for foreign direct investment, I think that's another example of how USAID kind of contributes to a battle between two models around the world.
We're in global competition with China, and you're in charge of a lot of weaponry.
I agree with that. I hope that was clear in my answer, that's the approach. But we also are meeting humanitarian needs, and there's an intrinsic good in that as well. But you're absolutely right. The tools, so many tools in the USAID toolkit are the tools that are incredibly important to strengthening democracy around the world and standing up to China's efforts to roll that back.
Amen.
Okay, I'll yield now to Ms. Mang.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. First, I just want to thank and associate myself with Mr. Fortenberry's comments about MEPA. Thank you for that. I have a question about the promise of young leaders around the world. Whether here in the US or abroad, young people have long been at the forefront of building peace in their communities by creating youth-led movements, organizations, and networks to mitigate negative effects of conflict and to prevent recurring cycles of violence. And yet COVID-19 secondary effects disproportionately disadvantage youth. The pandemic has kept nearly 1.6 billion students out of school, and 1 in 6 young people have stopped working since the onset of the pandemic. The US must invest in young people who carry unprecedented power to prevent climate change, promote democracy, good government, social justice, and spread American values. And in countries in conflict, it will be the young people who bear the burden of sustaining peace over generations, leading their societies from reconciliation to prosperity. With the largest youth population ever, what is USAID's strategy to ensure young people are at the center of the US government's pandemic recover strategies? How is USAID measuring the amount of funding from the International Affairs Budget account that is currently impacting young people? And lastly, what is the status of USAID's review of its decade-old youth development policy, and what should the strategic priorities of the updated policy be?
I will have to get back to you on the youth development policy and that review. I was tracking the gender policy review, but actually I've just not been briefed on that. Apologies. With regard to, I think the broader approach, I mean, take the continent of Africa. 69% of the population is under 30. It's the youngest population in the world. There's tremendous dynamism in that, but given particularly the challenge posed by the pandemic and the wallop to local economies, that's a lot of people looking for work and likely in the very near term not being able to find it, and that is inherently destabilizing. So I think you're going to see the mainstreaming of attention to youth, specifically in our economic growth planning, in our attention to the need to grow small businesses, in our partnership with the DFC, just again thinking of who is most affected by these large unemployment rates. You asked about it in the context of the pandemic. I would need to think a little bit more about that. Right now, in developing countries, you don't even have health workers who've received their 2 shots, right? You just, it's under 2%, I think, in Africa that's been vaccinated. So in terms of age groups, you would tend to go to the older and more vulnerable communities first after the health workers, as we've done in this country. So I'd want to think about that and maybe hear more from you about what you have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much. Administrator, Ambassador. We might have differences, but I think one area where most or all Americans agree is that the scourge of human trafficking is something that the United States has to be a leader in fighting. Any form of human trafficking, and I'm sure you agree with that. Are you aware that the State Department says that the Cuban medical missions have the hallmark of human trafficking, and they've done again reports talking about again how that program is in essence human trafficking of medical professionals. Are you aware of that history of human trafficking with the Cuban medical professional program?
I am familiar with those reports. I have not read the State Department reports, but I've seen some press coverage.
Yeah, and again, it's not new, as you well know. And again, I'm concerned because in a speech that you gave, when again reversing the longstanding tradition of the United States supporting, the Cuban people as opposed to the regime, you talked about how the Cubans' medical mission programs was awe-inspiring in the fact that they had sent medical professionals to fight Ebola. But again, if we agree that human trafficking is unacceptable in any form, and if there have been reports, including recent reports by even the United States State Department, that that program is in essence human trafficking. And by the way, I would more than gladly put you in touch with folks who have suffered from human trafficking, have been trafficked by that regime program. It's concerning that you would again say that that's awe-inspiring. That something that is clearly human trafficking can in any way be awe-inspiring. Do you want to clarify that, or were you not aware when you made that statement of the fact that the regime-sponsored program is in essence human trafficking, and that the regime receives the funding, they take the passports away from those that are trafficked, they go after their families? Were you not aware of that when you made that statement and that speech in front of the UN about how awe-inspiring that was?
So I traveled to West Africa at the height of the Ebola epidemic and was very struck by the work of Cuban doctors risking their lives on the front line to care for patients who were literally, dying prior to the arrival of medical doctors from the United States, from Cuba, and from other countries, were dying at the doorstep of clinics. And so that's what I was.
But were you not? Yeah, but were you not aware that was?
I had not read those reports at that time. No.
Okay, well, I just hope that again that's
which is Cuban doctors risking their lives to stand with the people of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone.
Sure, human trafficked people are victims, and they do wonderful things. But to say that it's awe-inspiring a program that that, again, the US State Department states is in essence human trafficking, you would understand why it's a worrisome thing. When you say that, again, if you weren't aware of it, it's interesting that, again, as being ambassador to the UN, you were not aware of it. But I'm hoping that you will look at that and that you will reconsider your statement of calling human trafficking or anything related to human trafficking awe-inspiring, because some of the victims are doing good things. I'm out of time, but I'll yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to yield now to Mr. Price.
Could we just correct the record and note,
Oh,
I
sure.
think I was just accused of calling human trafficking awe-inspiring. So let me just say that that is never anything that I've done. I've dedicated my entire career to fighting human trafficking. And
I will show you that speech and refresh your memory.
I did not refer to human trafficking as awe-inspiring. Please.
Ambassador, you referred to a program that the U.S. State Department has referred to human trafficking as awe-inspiring. You can try to sugarcoat that how you'd like.
To Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With limited time, I want to just briefly refer to a couple of other discussions and then possibly pose a third question. With respect to the work of the House Democracy Partnership with these parliaments in developing countries, I want to stress, Madam Administrator, that it's precisely the work of USAID and its contractors that lets us take this work with parliaments beyond conventional exchanges and actually gives it substance, actually improving parliamentary performance and effectiveness. So it just couldn't be more important. With respect to Gaza and the West Bank and the deeply destructive policies of the last administration, halting duly appropriated assistance funds to the West Bank and Gaza, closing the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, closing the PLO office in Washington, all of that needs to be reversed. And I'm encouraged by your assurance that that the aid that the previous administration had stopped is now being begun again. And I encourage you to do that with respect to projects that had been improved, with those that were receiving approval. And we intend to consult with you about some of the specifics of what it'll take to get that aid restored. Finally, let me turn to Afghanistan with limited time. I know this is a big question, but it's an important question. And this is an area where HDP has engaged with the Afghan parliament, with women in politics. There's just so much at stake in the faltering and struggling Afghan democracy surviving this period. I wonder what kind of assistance programs of the many that we've engaged in, which ones you think will we will be able to continue? What will it be most important to continue? And what are your concerns about the ability to administer and carry out this aid?
This is such an important question. I thank you for asking it. It's an area of huge focus at the White House, of course, at the State Department, Defense Department, and at Usaid. I mean, fundamentally, as we draw down, the security environment there is risk of deterioration, and the strength of the Afghan National Security Forces is going to be incredibly important, to them holding the line. And our programs, though, we have gone through them and are looking at how we can continue to support them, even with a smaller embassy and smaller USAID presence, civilian presence, how oversight and vetting can continue to be done, given how important that is to us and to you and to the taxpayer. I think the one thing I will say, sir, is that many of our partners were in Afghanistan before US troops arrived in 2001, and they have every intention of doing everything in their power to stay and support the Afghan people. So whether that's on seeking to keep girls in school, or the incredible health gains, maternal mortality has been cut by more than half, child mortality by 75% by virtue of these programs. And so it just couldn't be more important to try to sustain them and to stand by the Afghan people as they continue to suffer horrific pressure from the Taliban and attacks that we read about every day.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Power, I'm going to have to move fast. 2 questions on vaccine diplomacy as well as Plan Haiti. First, though, I want to return to this point that was made earlier about the Chinese model for development. It's basically this: predatory lending, resource extraction, and support for our authoritarian methodologies in governance. And while we spend about $25 billion a year around the world on humanitarian efforts to address a whole need, the holistic persons, the holistic needs of communities, China also makes a play while contributing virtually nothing in this regard for multilateral institutions, power and control of institutions, which we underwrite. It's not clear to me how much they can contribute, but they certainly look toward control of those institutions. In regards to vaccine diplomacy, we see this again, manifesting itself again. China on the march, seemingly ahead of us. Other countries around the world knowing that perhaps we have the best vaccines available, but China getting out in front of us. How is the WHO inordinately influenced by the Chinese? That's one question. And then secondly, what's our vaccine diplomacy trajectory? Then let me turn to the third question right quick, or the second question, Plan Haiti. We've spent so much money trying to help attack structural poverty at our doorstep here, and it's a bipartisan effort. But the idea here is to go deeper in terms of place-based strategy, fix the broken border situation, which is an underlying constraint in terms of normalcy and economic function, and then also create a few places where regenerative agriculture and conservation can become a realistic model based upon constructs that we consider to be not only supportable but fair. That's going to be Plan Haiti. I'd like your comments on that.
I don't want to dig in on Plan Haiti, but just to say how important the governance element is as the sine qua non, and how important it is that the country get back to regular order and legislative and presidential elections this coming.
Can I interject that there? I completely understand that, but without a specific set of examples where we know that this is a model that is scalable for development across not only Haiti, but across other regions, I'm afraid that we focus on these larger structural issues that may take the long term, obviously, to solve, that are critical to the underlying premise of any sort of economic well-being. That's my comment. Go ahead.
I hear you, though. We should have a longer conversation about this, because just with the investments we make, if we have government leaders who are pilfering money from the programs that we're putting in place, you know, those programs aren't going to be accountable to you or to us or to the
zones by U.S. standards. That's what I'm saying. That's placemaking. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Maybe I should pivot. Maybe I should dig further into Plan Haiti with you offline and learn about. But I do think USAID has done important work, and as you say, in Haiti, the problems are so chronic and longstanding. It's hard to show those returns, but the penal codes look different because of USAID's engagement. The COVID effects have been less severe. They're horrible, but less severe again because of the global health, because of the health program we've put in place. On the WHO, just briefly, I think that the United States being back at the table is incredibly important to offset Chinese influence. I will say, as a former U.S. ambassador, you know, when you represent a country, you are seeking to ensure that international institutions go your way, and you seek to influence those institutions. We want the United Nations to be promoting human rights around the world, women, peace, and security, et cetera, you know, non-sloppy lab practices, for example, when it comes to viruses. So every country is in these UN bodies, you know, trying to acquire more leverage and more clout. I think stepping back from international institutions gives China a free pass, and I do think that they use that influence as in the early days of the pandemic, perhaps to delay, for example, the declaration of a global pandemic or an international emergency. Beyond that, though, I think, you know, again, our best way on all fronts in which we and China are presenting these very different models, and I agree with your characterization of the Chinese model, is for us to be in the game and for us to be leading the world in vaccine diplomacy, which I hope is the path that we are now on. And I think just watch the space, because I think 80 million is what we have to get out the door in the very near term. But this is what countries most want from us right now, not only in our hemisphere, but all around the world.
Take a continent like Africa, which I think very much longs for our model of development, but has the Chinese model imposed upon them. We'll leave it there. Look forward to more dialogue with you on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll yield now to Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel?
Okay, I'm here, I hope. First of all, Administrator, thank you. It's for your
I believe you're frozen at this point, Ms. Frankel. I will yield. Okay, okay, we can't hear you.
can't. Wait,
Okay,
maybe.
okay, we
Okay,
can hear you now.
okay, good. Okay. So I was saying, I don't know what you heard, but what I was saying, Administrator, thank you for your thoughtfulness, taking the time to learn your job. I don't know if I'll agree with everything you say or do, but I do know you have an astonishingly spectacular background that you're bringing to this job. You have heart, you have intellect, and
we can't hear you, Ms. Frankel. You're muted. You're frozen. Let me yield now to Representative Torres, and we'll come back to you, Ms. Frankel. Ms. Torres. We'll
Thank
start
you.
the 3-minute clock.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman and Administrator Powers. I want to refocus to the Northern Triangle. Without the political will from the governments in the region, as you know, we need to prioritize working with capable, credible civil society partners and those committed to reform accountability. Yet I hear daily attacks against those who are carrying out this very important work. Internet trolls prompted by the governments and propaganda net centers in the region hurl conspiracy theories, share ugly racist and sexist slurs, and even share the location of the homes and workspaces of journalists, activists, and attorneys, threatening their safety and the safety of their families. We cheer the groundbreaking work of CSIG in Guatemala, yet many of the Guatemalan staff are unable to find work, having been outcast, blacklisted by the political and economic elites. Too often, we see those who are making real progress have to leave the country. So, Administrator Power, how does USAID help protect and support civil society activists and independent investigators? And in representing environments, how does USAID ensure their safety while also enabling these workers to continue this work within the country?
I think it was my second day in the job, I met virtually with activists from El Salvador and Honduras and heard firsthand really the level of concern and fear that many of them are living with, feeling as if, as you say, the pulpit is being used to disparage their work, to claim, as we've seen in other countries, including close to home, a kind of us versus them, mindset, when in fact, the work that these groups are doing, and these are vetted groups that we've worked with over many, many years, is some of the most patriotic work you could imagine. So, this is a very worrying set of developments. And you mentioned CSIG, now there's not even CSIG there, both not to employ the individuals that you mentioned who are now having trouble finding work, but also to continue to carry out the prosecutions that chipped away at the culture of impunity that abets corruption and violence. So I think what we can do is we raise our voices. We have a lot of leverage, as a country with such important, people to people and financial connections to these countries. That's what Vice President Harris has done already multiple times. I know it's what she will do on her trip. It's what I have done in my role. And I think people know on the ground that our embassies and our ambassadors and our mission directors and our staff are people who are going to, stand up for them, if they are suffering harassment or intimidation worse, and that's what we can offer. But above all, it's really just a tribute to the bravery of these individuals. They put themselves out there every single day because of how much they care about their countries.
Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to yield to Representative Wexton.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you again, Administrator Power, for joining us today. And before I forget, I definitely want to thank you for your advocacy for the Uyghurs and Turkic Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, and your strong stance against forced labor and in support of human rights in that region. You know, I represent a region in Northern Virginia that has one of the biggest populations of Uyghur Muslims in the United States, and they are all very, very concerned about their family members in China, and many of them haven't been able to communicate with them at all. So your words mean a lot to them, and I wanted to say thank you. I also represent a lot of Indian Americans who are deeply concerned, as I am, about the resurgent wave of COVID-19 in India, and they have many family members and friends who are directly impacted. But I'm happy to see the U.S. standing with the government of India and Indian people during this difficult time. Can you please give us a brief update on our assistance to India during COVID and what we're doing now?
Thank you so much. And this is where the funding that you all generously supplied through the American Rescue Plan has been so helpful to be able to do bilateral emergency response. In the first instance to India, I think we've done 7 plane loads of supplies, which range from masks and PPE to oxygen concentrators and the like. You know, we hope also to be moving out on vaccines. Even though India is a big manufacturer of vaccines, it's still a very small share of the population that's been vaccinated. One thing I would flag that I think is a template for what we can do in the future is that we have we're developing a really important partnership with the U.S.-India Business Council, which is comprised, I think, of 25 CEOs of some of the largest American companies. And as you know, the private sector has moved incredibly robustly and swiftly with its own deliveries of supplies. And now we're seeking to sync up so that we are coordinating our responses so as not to duplicate and to be able to ensure that we're meeting the needs as the Indian government and civil society defines them. We've also moved out now with planes to Nepal and trying to get supplies to other countries in South Asia because the spike that we've seen in India is now has now spread across the region. So again, what we're looking to do is be able to respond in an emergency way while also deepening our investments in global health security so as to ensure that these health systems are better able to respond in the future. One need that exists right now in the world is oxygen and oxygen concentrators. And so working with the private sector, we're looking to see, is there a way to source manufacturing of that to deal with that global supply shortage? Because there are certain things that the private sector is going to be able to do much more quickly than governments.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm glad to hear that your public-private partnership is working and it's going to be a model for the future. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Our final question will go now to my yielding to Ms. Frankel.
Okay, I'm gonna try. Can you hear me, Madam Chair?
I can hear you and see you.
Okay, good. Administrator, thank you for your candor and you.
Oh.
Okay, Ms. Frankel, you're frozen.
If she maybe turns her video off,
Yeah,
we can just, it's probably easier to get the mic.
Ms. Frankel, can you turn your video off and just do audio? Or do audio and not video? You're frozen. Okay, Ms. Frankel, I tell you what. Ms. Frankel? Okay, well, first of all, Administrator Power, let me thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time and with your testimony. Also, just I want to recognize your once again your history of service to our country, to the world, and really on behalf of the most vulnerable everywhere throughout the world. And you can see there's much interest from all of our committee members in terms of the important work that you do for the millions of people who rely on us and yourself leading this effort throughout the world. So you have a huge task before you, but we want to partner with you in whatever way we can. And so I just want to thank you again and look forward to our continuing conversation. And I know members will reach out to you individually. Finally, let me just mention to members, if you have questions you would like to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within the next 7 days. And so thank you all again. I want to thank our staff for helping us through this virtual hearing, and we look forward to our continuing work. So this concludes today's hearing. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.